Well, since 21st Century Radio's birth about 20 years ago, we've covered UFO research frequently, and I have been privileged to have reviewed some important research regarding UFOs and consciousness. Over the past decades, there have been authors whose views I have greatly admired. In my opinion, the work of Dr. Jacques Vallée in regards to UFOs is right on the mark. It has always been my opinion that even though some of the UFO reports may have been concerned with beings from some other planet or galaxy or star system or dimension, that many of the reports may have been about other dimensional beings belonging to Mother Earth. Dr. Vallée championed this theory and was soundly rebuked by the nuts and bolts ufologists. Another author we repeatedly reviewed was Dr. Rick Strassman, and his research published in his groundbreaking work, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, a doctor's revolutionary research into the biology of near-death and mystical experiences, which shed a beacon of light on just who these mysterious beings are and with whom we are sharing our planet. It took us several months to convince Art Bell and Coast to Coast to interview Rick Strassman, and when he did our planet a great service. Now, we'll leave it to one of our planet's legendary researchers in the new paradigm to not only reference the important contributions of Drs. Vallée and Strassman, but utilize their research in potentially resolving who we are on planet Earth and what may have triggered our consciousness for the past 35,000 years. The book is Supernatural, that is, Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, and it's by Graham Hancock, perhaps one of the few researchers who are able to take us where others dare not or just won't take us there at all. Graham Hancock is the author of Fingerprints of the Gods, Keeper of Genesis, The Mars Mystery, Heaven's Mirror and Underworld, and all these, of course, were #1 bestsellers. The Guardian has credited him with having, quote, invented a new genre, an intellectual whodunit by a do-it-yourself sleuth, end quote. Well, what an honor for you to join us, and congratulations on one of the most important works in the UFO field in decades, Graham.
Thank you, Bob. I really appreciate it, and it's a great pleasure to be with you.
Now, your book is called Supernatural. Perhaps you could begin by defining what you mean by supernatural.
Yes, absolutely. It's one of those words that's got loaded with all kinds of association in our societies, and because we live in a very materialistic society where everything is based on what you can weigh, measure, and count, there's an assumption that whenever one refers to the supernatural, that one is somehow slightly unhinged. And this is most unfortunate, because supernatural experiences have been a constant factor for the human race for more than 35,000 years, and are documented way back on the painted caves, the first evidence of art and religion that we have in the archaeological record. When we speak of the supernatural, we're speaking of phenomena, encounters, experiences, events which cannot be explained in terms of the natural laws of cause and effect, the supposed laws of physics that our scientists have drawn up for us. And we would include in this category encounters with fairies and elves, encounters with ghosts, encounters with spirits, and such encounters persist in an extremely targeted and regular way amongst shamans in tribal and hunter-gatherer societies all around the world. Angels, demons, the sense of entering a parallel realm, a parallel world where perhaps time runs differently than it does here. All these experiences are extensively documented in the long history of humanity, and our science today says that they are all just complete nonsense, that they're not real, that they don't exist, that they're just fantasies and illusions. And when people do try to track down these experiences, they tend to try to use supposedly scientific technology. Everybody's heard of the so-called ghost meter, which will supposedly register the presence of a ghost or a spirit. And I think, to cut a long story short, that the problem here is that we are using the wrong tools to encounter and deal with and explain the supernatural. I believe that the supernatural and all supernatural experiences, every one of them, can be understood when we realize that they have to do with the state of consciousness of the observer of those experiences. In the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness that is favored by our society today, and in fact which is almost legislated as the only appropriate state of consciousness for us to have, we are never going to have supernatural experiences. We need to be in an altered state of consciousness of some kind in order to have those experiences. And that altered state of consciousness may occur spontaneously. Some individuals just are spontaneously able to slip into a visionary state. In others, it may be brought about by the atmosphere or perhaps the electromagnetic vibrations in a particular location. And in a large number of others, particularly shamans in hunter-gatherer societies, these altered states of consciousness are brought about by the ingestion of hallucinogenic plants, which put the individual into a deep visionary state where the experiences become accessible. Now, most people, when they hear the word hallucinogen, immediately think that a hallucination is some kind of illusion. But what I'm suggesting is that these experiences that we call visions or hallucinations are in fact another modality of perception, that we have our five senses to deal with this physical world, and we have a sixth sense as well, which can be activated in an altered state of consciousness, that we need to look at the brain as a receiver of consciousness rather than simply as a generator of consciousness. And that as a receiver, just like a television receiver, its receiver wavelength can be retuned. Most of the time, most of us are tuned into what Rick Strassman, a doctor at the University of New Mexico, who you mentioned a moment ago, calls channel normal. But many other channels are available and broadcasting to us all the time. And if only we can step our attention sideways from the extreme focus on the material world and open ourselves to these other wavelengths, then we can regularly and indeed routinely and repeatably encounter paranormal and supernatural phenomena. So it's a matter of the state of consciousness of the observer. And shamans, who tend to be looked down upon by our scientists as primitive savages, are in fact the masters of the technology of consciousness that enables us to access these realms and to learn from these realms and to benefit from these realms. And it may be the case that part of the problem in our society today is that we have willfully cut ourselves off from those realms of experience by legislating and honoring only one state of consciousness, the alert problem-solving state, when so many other states of consciousness are available to us and indeed are part of our birthright as human beings.
Well, you, of course, mentioned Dr. Rick Strassman and his importance of his work. What is the importance of his work?
It's extremely important work. First of all, Rick Strassman is a medical doctor at the University of New Mexico, a psychiatrist, was the first scientist in the United States for more than 20 years to be given permission by the federal government to work with human volunteers and hallucinogens. And he used a very powerful hallucinogen called dimethyltryptamine, which he gave to a large number of volunteers over a period of 8 or 9 years during the 1990s. And what happened was that these individuals, once you're given DMT, it plunges you immediately, almost instantly, into a deeply altered state of consciousness. Typically, the person who has taken DMT falls silent. They don't seem to be registering the everyday world very, very closely. And that's because their consciousness has gone on an extraordinary journey. And what was really amazing was that Rick Strassman's volunteers all began to report encounters and teachings and experiences with beings and entities during their altered state of consciousness. And these beings and entities were recognizably the same across the whole range of the volunteers. Now, normally, when a large number of people agree on a particular experience, we regard that experience as real. And this was the point that Rick Strassman eventually got himself to, that possibly this was what was happening with his volunteers, that the receiver wavelengths of their brains were being retuned by DMT, and they were gaining genuine access to other dimensions of reality and to the beings that inhabit those dimensions, and because those dimensions are real, although not normally accessible to us or our instruments, this explains why everybody had the same experience. And of course, you can imagine the kind of hot water that Rick Strassman got himself into with all kinds of lobbies for even suggesting that. Firstly, the mainstream materialist science lobby is offended by the notion that there might actually be spiritual realities. And secondly, the nuts and bolts UFO lobby was offended by a particular discovery of Rick Strassman's, that rather more than half of his volunteers reported experiences that were almost identical in every respect with the classic UFO abduction experience, except they were definitely not being physically abducted. Their bodies were lying right there on the hospital bed in front of Dr. Strassman. So we know that they were not physically abducted, but the experiences they had were indistinguishable from the experiences reported worldwide by people who believe that they've been abducted by UFOs. And really the breakthrough that Rick Strassman made was to demonstrate that DMT, dimethyltryptamine, the hallucinogenic substance that he was giving to his volunteers, is also produced by every single human being on this planet by our own brains, and specifically in the pineal gland of our brains. And what Rick was suggesting was that people who have the UFO abduction experience are people who spontaneously overproduce DMT. All of us have it in our bodies, but most of us have it in such minute sub-psychedelic quantities that it has no daily effect on our consciousness. He was suggesting that UFO abductees overproduce DMT, and that this allows these experiences in. And it's very important to emphasize that he's not saying that the experiences are an artifact of DMT or of disturbed brain chemistry. They're not generated or caused by that. They are admitted into consciousness by changing the receiver wavelength of the brain. So an analogy might be a telescope. If we want to study a very distant star with our telescope, we have to refocus that telescope. And as we do so, there will be definite observable changes in the relationship between the lenses inside the barrel of the telescope. And eventually the star will come clearly into view. Now, we would be quite wrong to say the star is the changes inside the barrel of the telescope. Quite wrong, because the star is real, it is there, and the changes inside the barrel of the telescope simply allow us to see it. And by analogy, that's what Rick is suggesting happens with the human brain, that the changes in brain chemistry that occur effectively refocus the brain and allow us to attend to another level or dimension of reality.
Well, of course, some naysayers might say that it's likely that so many of Strassman's volunteers reported experiences similar to alien abductions because they had all read about such things in the popular press or seen TV shows about them, and that these memories came to the fore under the influence of DMT. But wait till we hear what Rick and I would almost refer to you as Dr. Graham Hancock. He is awarded an honorary Ph.D. from Bullwinkle's Wasamatta-U University. This is just extraordinary work to bring all together in one book. Don't get one, get a couple. The reason being, your friends are going to want to borrow it. You'll never get it back. So save yourself the time and trouble. We'll be back with our guest, Graham Hancock. Supernatural Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind. That's a meaningful title, friends. Meetings with Ancient Teachers of Mankind. The Disinformation Company, boy, they have put out some great books in the last several years. Or go to Graham, Graham, Hancock.com, GrahamHancock.com, or go to 21st Century Radio and click on this week's show at the top right-hand corner.
This is Andy Serkis from Lord of the Rings.
And you've been listening to 21st Century Radio with Bob Hieronimus.
Okay, so what would the naysayers say? How do they attack this?
Well, yes, you're making a very good point that the fact that more than half of Rick Strassman's volunteers at the University of New Mexico, given DMT, had experiences that were indistinguishable from alien abduction experiences. The naysayers, the critics say, oh, well, this is easy to explain. because obviously those guys had simply been reading the popular press. You know, they'd watched the X-Files, they'd heard accounts of alien abductions, and somehow in their, with their disturbed brain chemistry, all this got mixed up and came out as an experience of an alien abduction. But Rick Strassman does, in fact, have a complete answer to that problem. As he correctly points out, research was conducted during the 1950s, the early 1950s, using dimethyltryptamine, DMT, and human volunteers. And in fact, it was conducted by researchers in Czechoslovakia and in the United States. Now, I emphasize the 1950s because this is very important. Although there had been sightings of UFOs and of flying saucers going back to the late 40s and into the 1950s, there was not a single case of an alien abduction experience reported publicly until 1961, and that was the famous case of Betty and Barney Hill.
Mm-hmm.
And prior to 1961, there was simply no publicity whatsoever surrounding that subject, and yet the human volunteers given DMT in the 1950s reported exactly the same kinds of encounters with entities in objects in the sky, who did painful things to their bodies and inserted objects under their skin and so on, that we find with the later UFO abduction reports. So it seems to me that actually this UFO abduction experience has come into the culture from the visionary realm, rather than the other way round. It hasn't got into the visionary realm from the culture, it's got into the culture from the visionary realm, from visionary experiences that people have had down the ages for centuries and centuries, indeed for thousands of years, as I document in my book. And you know, inevitably, the culture in which we live does condition our perceptions. There's no doubt about that. Interpretation is built into perception from the get-go. Now, we live in a culture which has invented spacecraft. We've sent men to the moon. We have rockets. We are actively exploring outer space. And so there's a natural tendency when people see something flying and a strange being inside it who interacts with us, there's a natural tendency for them to impose our cultural interpretation on that and say, oh, that must be an alien, that must be a spaceman from another planet who's come here. But really what helps to put this in perspective is the realization that not only from Rick Strassman's work, but if you go back into the folklore, you find that beings exactly, in every respect, exactly like the ones that we call aliens today, have been interacting with humans for thousands and thousands of years, called different names at different periods of history. And one of the areas of the book that I go into in great length in the book is the astonishing depth of comparison between beings that are called fairies, were called fairies and elves in the Middle Ages, and the beings that we call aliens today. And it's very clear, to me at any rate, that these are the same beings, consistently reported, but seen through slightly different cultural spectacles. So the fairies flew in flying castles or flying ships, and the aliens fly in flying saucers, but the same experience is being had and just viewed through a different cultural framework.
Well, that's always been one of the great things about your work, Graham, in that your documentation in this area as well as in your other books goes far and wide and is very deep. And that's the reason why I don't think you write a book that's under 600 pages. And that's one of the reasons why it takes so long. I could never get my publisher to go over 400 pages.
Yes, I have to say, just as an aside to that, I do sometimes worry about writing books that are too long. But you know, the reason I do a long book, and I particularly did a long book with Supernatural, is because what I'm proposing is really goes so much against the grain of established science that I expect established scientists to attack me like a pack of mad dogs. I've had this experience before. They don't like alternative ideas, and they will attack. And so what I try to do is to build in all the evidence that is necessary to respond to that attack within the book itself, and to provide my readers with that evidence so that they are also armored against what I call the debunking industry.
Well, it is an industry, and it's alive and well with PsyCop and other organizations that just love to tear apart these areas. And, of course, when you go back over their history, you find that, and as I've had experience with James Randi and others, I don't want to offend you, Dr. Graham, but I mean, I have never seen such BS in all my life.
Completely agree with you. Total BS. Actually, CSICOP, which stands for the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, is an extremely sinister organization in my view.
Well, it's worse than sinister. I mean, I think that they absolutely break the rules of ethics
Yes.
in regards to what I've seen them do to other researchers that drove some of these researchers to their grave.
Absolutely.
Gauquilin being one.
Yes.
The great soul, great teacher, humiliated, destroyed. I'm sorry, I can't get into this, but there's
No, it's absolutely, it's really important to realize that there is a highly funded, extremely efficient network of thought control operating in our societies, and CSICOP is part of that network. It's designed to discredit by any means, fair or foul, and usually foul, to discredit by any means any idea that is not acceptable to the current ruling paradigm.
And of course it was with the death of Phil Klass, I think, yes, Phil Klass, that we finally got to see what the CIA and FBI really thought about his opinions, which were they basically did not consider what he said to have too much credibility because of his inaccurate information. But that's not how the media portrayed it.
No.
That is not how CSICOP portrayed it. And
Exactly.
they should, I have to get off of that.
I'm
sorry.
I'll rant on that subject.
I know, I could spend hours on that because I've seen so many important researchers dumped in this area. Now, what are the kind of links between, similarities between spirits, fairies, and aliens?
I go into these three categories of supernatural beings at some length in the book, and let's speak first of the spirits. Contact with spirits is the daily experience of shamans in tribal and hunter-gatherer societies. And one thing that is the universal characteristic of all shamans everywhere, wherever we find them in the world and wherever we find them in history, is that they deliberately induce an altered state of consciousness in order to contact the spirit world. It's as though they recognize that there's a secret doorway inside our own minds which we must alter our consciousness in order to open. And once we open that doorway, we can project our consciousness through into other realms and make contact with other beings. And typically, shamans refer to these beings as spirits. And the means they use to alter consciousness vary enormously. I mentioned earlier the most common means undoubtedly is the use of visionary plants like ayahuasca in the Amazon. And I went down to the Amazon to drink ayahuasca with shamans so that I could experience what they were experiencing. And indeed, I did. So spirits are one category. Another category became very notorious in the Middle Ages in Europe, and that are the beings called fairies or elves. We start seeing written accounts of encounters with fairies and elves roughly from about 1,000 years ago through until the early 1950s, just about the time that the alien encounters began to be documented, the early 1960s. That was around the time that it became unfashionable to speak of fairies and elves anymore. And the third category, which I believe rightly belongs in the category of supernatural beings, are these entities that we tend, in the popular press, we refer to as aliens or greys. I think that all of these beings are the same entities, simply viewed through different cultural spectacles, and there are particular characteristics of these entities that make that very, very clear. First and foremost, they very frequently appear in a form that is part animal and part human, and in fact there's a technical term for such creatures. They're called therianthropes, and that's from the Greek therion, which means wild beast, and anthropos, which means man. So they're a combination of beast and man. Now, this is the most common form in which spirits are encountered by shamans. Less well known is the fact that it was an extremely common form in which fairies were encountered in the Middle Ages. I have a woodcut on my desk, which is from Holland in the 15th century, and it shows a group of fairies dancing in a circle. And as you look closely at the woodcut, you can see that the fairies are shown to be part animal and part human in form. There's just an enormous amount of documentation of this. There was a fearsome medieval fairy called Melusine, who was part human and part serpent, and she used to abduct human babies. This brings us to the case of UFO abductees. People who haven't studied the UFO abduction experience closely may not be aware that it isn't simply a matter of the so-called greys, that very often the being who later shapeshifts or transforms into a grey first appears in animal form or in part animal, part human form. So there right away is a strange connection between these three different categories of beings. Secondly, all of these three different categories of beings, spirits, fairies and elves, aliens, all of them abduct human beings. Humans have the experience of being abducted by them. Everybody knows that that's the keynote of the alien abduction experience, but again, if we go back to the Middle Ages, we find that that's what fairies and elves did all the time. They would abduct people, and when those people came back, they had missing time. Their connection with time in the two different realms had shifted. And spirits continuously abduct shamans. Very typically, the shaman's first encounter with the spirit world takes the form of a forcible abduction. So, again, something extraordinary going on there. Interbreeding between these entities and humans, very commonly reported amongst alien abductees. Again, this happened repeatedly with the beings that were called fairies and elves in the Middle Ages, and it happens repeatedly with shamans and the spirit beings that they encounter. Many shamans who I know believe that they have a lover in the spirit world, and they even have hybrid children in the spirit world who are part human and part spirit, and that experience is shared by UFO abductees today. So the list actually just goes on, and I do document this at great length in Supernatural, that there are close and stunning parallels between these three different categories of experience. And I do need to emphasize I'm not the first to have walked this road. The great researcher, Dr. Jacques Vallée, and his wonderful 1969 book, Passport to Magonia, was the first real opening of this area of inquiry, showing the links between fairies and elves and aliens. And part of what I've done is to take Jacques Vallée's brilliant, groundbreaking work, which takes us up to 1969, to take that work forward with all the much more recent information that has become available since then. But I do absolutely need to pay tribute to that great thinker, that groundbreaking thinker, Dr. Jacques Vallée.
Have you sent him a copy of your book?
I haven't sent him a copy of my book. I don't know how to do so, but perhaps we can talk off the air and you let me know how to do this.
Yes, we could do that, because, being a scientist, he's interested, obviously, in learning the truth. And when you come up against UFO organizations that think only nuts and bolts of UFOs, they really just did a horrific job of not examining his research. They already have formed their opinions.
Exactly, because they're so wedded to the paradigm of the material world, which ironically is the same paradigm that mainstream scientists are wedded to.
Oh, just by chance. That's just a coincidence. Now,
they find it very difficult to conceive of interdimensional contact with beings that are not in a material form or not fully in a material form. I'm not ruling out, by the way, the possibility that these interdimensional contacts do from time to time involve physical breakthroughs into this realm, and it may be that the thing we call the flying saucer may be some kind of technology for jumping between dimensions. In fact, one of the curious issues I look at is the strange links and similarities between what was called the fairy dance in the Middle Ages, fairies dancing very rapidly in a circle and then suddenly disappearing or appearing, and between these revolving UFOs that we call flying saucers, which again suddenly appear and disappear. Could it be? Could the fairy dance be an earlier form of the technology that we now call UFOs? And could that technology be not about crossing interstellar space, but about jumping between dimensions? And,
that great insight there, and especially in regards to the shamans and others who study under them, dancing for 2-3 days, entering an altered state, the Sufis, etc., etc. Well, when we return, there is another major contribution in this work, friends, that you're going to highly enjoy, and this deals with, you talk about a light being switched on in the human brain all around the world. This is just thrilling stuff to read, as you will soon find out. And, of course, we'll take our final break of this hour. And our guest is Graham Hancock. The book is Supernatural Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, the Disinformation Company. Well, that's a darn good title for some individual publisher there. GrahamHancock.com, or go to 21stCenturyRadio.com and click on this week's show at the top right-hand corner.
Hello, this is Uri Geller, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
Now, Graham, again, in the book you talk about a light being switched on in the human brain all around the world, more or less at the same time. What do you mean by that?
Yes, in fact, this was the mystery that brought me into this research. As you know, my background has been looking into the possibility of a lost civilization, and which I did in a series of books, the best known of which I think was Fingerprints of the Gods.
Yeah.
And really, when I started out the inquiry that led to my new book, Supernatural, I thought I would go back further in history and look at the mystery of human origins. And I didn't know when I began the inquiry that I was going to end up writing a book about the supernatural. The research itself brought this evidence to the fore as I went along. I started out by looking at what's called the human career. And the human career can be traced to the last 6 million years, from the last common ancestor with the chimpanzee around 6 million years ago, through until the appearance of fully anatomically modern humans, just like you and I, for which the earliest surviving fossil evidence goes back just under 200,000 years. So you're looking at a 6 million year story with anatomically modern humans appearing about 200,000 years ago. And the astonishing thing is that for almost the entire span of that very long period of time, sad to say, it is 6 million years of boredom. Our ancestors were just unbelievably dull. They were not the kind of folk that you would enjoy sitting down to have dinner with, because they would have had nothing to say for themselves. In fact, there's a great deal of evidence that they probably didn't have language at all until relatively recently. No stone tools appear at all in the archaeological record until about 2.5 million years ago. And then the first types of tool are introduced. They're extremely simple, but what's particularly notable is that once that tool type, it's called the Alderwan tool type, once that tool type has been introduced, it sticks without any change, no innovation, no creativity, nothing of the kind of behavior that we associate with modern humans. It sticks without any change for more than 1 million years. And then another tool type, only slightly different, is introduced, and lo and behold, that sticks without any change for the next 1 million years or so. And this, you find no evidence of spirituality, no evidence of creativity, no evidence of lateral thinking. In fact, it's amazing that our ancestors survived at all. And what's really striking is that even after 200,000 years ago, when you have anatomically modern humans whose brains are identical to ours, who are in every respect identical to us today, even then, their behavior still remains astonishingly dull and unrecognizable as human. They are simply tool-using apes. And then suddenly, and it really is very sudden, some kind of critical mass is reached, and round about 40,000 years ago or less, all over the world, in an astonishingly short period of time, we suddenly find ourselves dealing in the fossil record with people who don't only look exactly like us, but who behave exactly like us as well. They have spirituality. They have religion. They believe in life after death. We can be sure of this because they start burying their dead, and when they bury their dead, they bury them with grave goods, with food and water. And that means that something has convinced them that some essence of the individual continues on after death. But the single most striking evidence for this huge change, and I do compare it with a light being switched on in the human brain all over the world. The single most striking evidence for this is the appearance of the most astonishing works of art on the walls of painted caves in Europe and in rock shelters in Africa and as far afield as Australia. This rock art suddenly appears. It's extremely accomplished technically. It's very, very beautiful to look at, and its theme is not the observation of everyday reality, but the depiction of encounters with beings that can only be described as supernatural beings. And all over the world, whether it's the paintings of the San Bushmen in southern Africa, or whether it's the paintings of Stone Age Europeans in southern France, you find that they are depicting beings that are part animal and part human in form. And there's just no way that we can say that these are just depictions of men dressed up in skins. Although even if they were, we'd have to ask ourselves what led people to do that. Because, for example, if you go to Chauvet Cave in France, where the art dates back more than 33,000 years, you can find the most astonishing image of a man with the legs and hips and lower back of a human being, and then the upper body and head of a bison, and he is straddling a female figure, and the female figure is depicted as headless, but her right arm is transforming into the head of a lion. So right there we have bison man and lion woman, and what is depicted is a process of supernatural transformation from a human into an animal form, or from an animal into a human form. And these kind of images are repeated all around the world. And at the very moment that our ancestors start painting, documenting, I would say, their encounters with supernatural beings, that's the moment when everything else in their behavior changes as well. Their hunting strategies become much more cunning. They start to anticipate where the animals will be at a particular time of year. Their tools take a quantum leap forward, and everywhere there's the evidence for spirituality and religion, not least in these amazing painted caves, which I think of as the great cathedrals of prehistoric antiquity.
Well, I know our listeners are probably thinking, oh, what do these look like, etc. And friends, there are, I don't know how many illustrations you have in this work. There's a whole section that deals with full color illustrations, and they are indeed beautiful, but some of the photographs of the images within the caves, there must be 20, 30 of them that you have here, and that make it's very convincing from the standpoint of, did this happen? Well, it looks like it to me. And again, when we get back to this concept of 35,000 years ago, in the cave art. Now, my interest in symbolism and archetypes, there's so much that could be said about a cave that I'm not going to talk about here. But caves, of course, have a lot to do with, on other higher levels, higher awareness, the cranium, the brain, etc., and within the brain, the spirit within it, etc. But that's not what I'm referring to. However, there is a...
Well, caves themselves are very... any deep cave is a very special place. And what's striking about the cave art from Europe 30,000 years ago or so is that very often this art was painted in the deepest and most inaccessible reaches of the cave, where the artists would have had to make an incredibly difficult and dangerous journey, often over deadly falls and underground rivers, to get to the place where they painted these images. And in fact, it's fortunately there are a number of caves in France which are still open to the public. Most of them are closed. The archaeological fraternity have grabbed them as their own special possession and will only allow archaeologists in there. And by and large, for the last 100 years of study of cave art, archaeologists have achieved very little in explaining what is going on. There's been a breakthrough in the last 20 years, which we can talk about, but most of the last 100 years, archaeologists haven't achieved much, and what they've done is they've kept the public out of these first spiritual centers of mankind. I think of them as energizing spiritual devices. To walk in a cave like Peshmerl in France, which I visited several times, it's a spiritual, it's a supernatural experience. You find your state of consciousness being affected by the cave itself, and you begin to realize that the artists were seeing the cave wall as some kind of veil or membrane separating them off from the other world, and so they would see a bulge or a shape in the cave wall, and they would build that into their art. So It's as though animals are emerging through the cave walls. Beings that are part animal, part human are literally coming out of these cave walls towards us. And there's a sense of another realm beyond the wall, and it's very strong, even today, 30,000 years after the images were painted.
Well, in the 3 or 4 minutes we have before the end of this segment, could you tell us, or at least introduce us to the work of Professor David Lewis Williams of the University of
Witwatersrand in South Africa?
South
Yes.
Africa.
David Lewis Williams is been a very important researcher for me, and in terms of anchoring my work in the latest scientific evidence. As I mentioned, for almost 100 years, scholars dominated the caves but failed to come up with any satisfactory explanation for the cave art. It's really only in the last 20 years, initially in the teeth of furious opposition from his colleagues, that David Lewis Williams' work has come to the fore, and I can now say that it is really the ruling paradigm in the study of cave art. And what he's saying is absolutely revolutionary. He's saying that what explains this art and what explains the astonishing similarities that are found all around the world in rock and cave art is that the artists were shamans, and that they, like shamans today, were deliberately using and entering altered states of consciousness, of visionary states, and they were then documenting, fixing for all time, painting on the cave wall or the wall of the rock shelter, the beings that they encountered in that visionary state. And this is what explains all the similarities. And although initially there was opposition to David's work, because you know, if you put it in plain language, what he's saying is that our ancestors were taking hallucinogens, and that the origins of religion and the origins of art are rooted and grounded in the very kind of experiences that our societies have made criminal today, and legislate against viciously and ruin people's lives over. That those kind of experiences, so despised to us today, were actually fundamental in what made us human in the first place.
And of course, these chemicals, the hallucinogens, so to speak, are found within our human body. Found
within the human body, as in the case of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and very likely the psychedelic agent that was used by our ancestors in Stone Age Europe was a little mushroom called psilocybe semilanciata, the liberty cap. And I've had work done on the DNA of liberty cap mushrooms to absolutely prove that they existed alongside our ancestors in Stone Age Europe more than 30,000 years ago.
Well, that's why, in part, there are so many important areas of this work. No wonder it takes 600 and plus pages. Maybe you should have gone to 1,200. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that.
No, but I mean, it's important to put it all out there.
Of course, and to have it documented, the documentation is so overwhelming, and it's taken from sources that I believe are extremely credible. I mean, the whole thing about the cave art in regards to, say, for instance, such things as the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they have been, by and large, just taken over by traditional research, peer group type thinking, which has prevented us from really getting to the important aspects of the scrolls, especially the copper scroll. And as we find out in our culture, we've done that just about everywhere in every field of knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think,
unfortunately, it gets taken over and crushed sometimes for a long period of time. And in fact, the first individuals who recognized cave art for what it was back in the 19th century were subjected to exactly the same kind of vicious debunking attacks that are subjected to radical thinkers today. But they were right.
Well, if the church still had its power, maybe they would have locked them up and burned them as well. We'll be back with our guest next hour, Graham Hancock, Supernatural Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, a disinformation company, grahamhancock.com, or go to 21stcenturyradio.com and click on this week's show at the top right-hand corner. And we're continuing with our discussion with Graham Hancock, the book Supernatural Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, the Disinformation Company. And you please go to his website, Graham Hancock, Graham Hancock.com, or you can go the easy way to 21stcenturyradio.com and click on this week's show at the top right-hand corner. Now, Graham, you have taken several of these shamanic hallucinogens. Is this correct?
Yes, it is. I've always felt that that as a researcher, I cannot simply sit in my armchair and refer to piles and piles of academic literature. I have to get out there in the field and have direct experience of what I'm talking about. And if I can't do that, then I might as well not talk about it at all. That's why for an earlier book that I wrote, Underworld, my wife Santa, who's a photographer, and I learned to scuba dive back in 1996, and we spent the next 5 years putting in more than 2,000 dives, often in deep and dangerous water all around the world, looking for underwater ruins that were submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. So it became the same issue for me with my new book, Supernatural, and the research there, because we mentioned the work of Dr. David Lewis Williams, which has absolutely demonstrated, to the satisfaction of the most vehement critics in the archaeological and anthropological world, absolutely demonstrated that the art of the painted caves was an art of visions. It was an art of shamans who had experienced deeply altered states of consciousness, and when they came back into a normal state of consciousness, they then painted on the cave walls the beings and also the strange geometrical patterns and other shapes that they had seen in these altered states. Secondly, which helps to illuminate this work further, there's very important scientific research. We mentioned Rick Strassman's work at the University of New Mexico, but back in the 50s and 60s, there was quite a lot of scientific work done before government stepped in and stopped it. Quite a lot of scientific work done with human volunteers on hallucinogens, whether those hallucinogens were mescaline, whether they were LSD, whether they were psilocybin or other hallucinogens. A whole range of them were used in research into consciousness. And again, very importantly, those volunteers, when they were asked to draw or paint what they had seen in their visionary state, produced images of hybrid beings, part animal, part human, produced images of geometrical patterns that are identical to the imagery that we see on the painted caves from more than 35,000 years ago. So it becomes clear that altered states of consciousness are the unifying factor in all of this evidence. And how could I write about altered states of consciousness if I didn't experience altered states of consciousness myself? And particularly, I wanted to do so as much as possible in a shamanic context. And for that reason, I went down to the Amazon, and I spent a couple of months in the Amazon with shamans of the Amazon, drinking the powerful hallucinogenic brew known as ayahuasca. It means the vine of souls. And it's called the vine of souls because it is very specifically used by shamans, amongst other purposes, for contacting the souls, the spirits of deceased ancestors, and sometimes for resolving a problem that we may have with our ancestors, something, or gaining advice from the ancestors, and often gaining healing wisdom from them. This brew is a mixture of two different Amazonian plants. Now, when we bear in mind that there are more than 150,000 different species of plants and trees in the Amazon, it is an astonishing achievement that the shamans of the Amazon, going back probably 10,000 years, were able to pick out two plants that will not have any effect when taken individually, but when mixed together will put us into a deeply altered state of consciousness and allow us access to visionary realms. And when you ask shamans how their ancestors did this, they say the spirits themselves taught us how to do it. There's no way that this could have been done by normal processes of trial and error. Now, the ayahuasca brew is a mixture of the ayahuasca vine, it's a jungle creeper that hangs down from the tall trees, and of a bush that's known as chacruna in the Amazon, and its botanical name is Psychotria viridis. And the leaves of this bush are rich in DMT, dimethyltryptamine, the same substance that Rick Strassman gave in pure form by injection to his volunteers at the University of New Mexico. Rick gave DMT by injection because normally, if DMT is taken orally, in pure form, it has no effect whatsoever. There's an enzyme in our stomach that destroys DMT in contact. So you could munch away on hundreds and hundreds of those leaves from the bush Cicoria viridis, and it would have no effect on you whatsoever. It's only when it's mixed with the ayahuasca vine. The vine contains other chemicals which switch off that enzyme in our stomachs and allow DMT to be absorbed orally. And when absorbed orally, it produces an experience that lasts for 2 to 3 hours instead of the typical 12 minutes that Rick Strassman's volunteers were having with pure DMT given by injection. And the experience is subtly different from the experience of pure DMT because it's more drawn out, because it allows you a more extended and reflective contact with the beings and entities that you encounter in this altered state. Now, I do need to emphasize that ayahuasca is an absolutely vile-tasting brew. There really is no taste on the planet that I can think of that is worse. Sometimes I compare it to the essence of a pile of old, unlaundered socks, a little bit of sulfur, some raw sewage, some very acidic vinegar, and just a hint of chocolate. And even speaking about it now makes me shudder. I mean, the taste is just absolutely vile. No, but don't imagine that anybody does this for kicks. You have to brace yourself in order to drink this. When you drink it, and typically you drink quite a small amount in highly concentrated form, throw it down your throat. The taste lingers for a while. For the first 45 minutes or so, you feel pretty normal. Then things happen at a physical level. You start noticing that you're feeling a bit nauseous, a bit giddy. Your stomach starts to rumble, and pretty soon you're going to have to throw up, and you're going to have diarrhea, vomiting and diarrhea. They call ayahuasca the purge in the Amazon for very good reasons. All of us who drink it do have this purging experience, and that's part of the lesson that ayahuasca teaches you. As a Westerner, I mean, I'm British, and we're very, very sort of precious about our bodily functions, and we don't want to have any of this happening in a public arena. But in the Amazon, it does happen in a public arena, surrounded by other villagers who are there also drinking ayahuasca as part of their daily lives. And you just have to go behind a tree and deal with it. And so it teaches you actually that the body is not what human beings are. What we are is consciousness, pure consciousness, and what ayahuasca is doing at the level of consciousness is absolutely extraordinary. There's a sense of being plunged into a completely convincing parallel world. Initially you see swirling patterns, geometrical patterns, very regularly repeated, and then you have a sense of breaking through into this absolute other reality, where you meet beings. And sometimes these beings look like fairies and elves, or greys as we call them today. Very often they are part animal, part human in form. For example, I saw a creature that had the head of a crocodile and the body of a human being. I saw a creature that was part jaguar and part human. Everybody in the world who drinks ayahuasca, it doesn't matter where they are, they can be in a western city or they can be in the heart of the Amazon, are going to see serpents. And these serpents are not just like ordinary everyday serpents. They're often gigantic, absolutely huge, and they communicate with you. I know how nuts this sounds, but I'm simply reporting the experience, that there's a sense of communication, of dealing with an intelligent entity that has something to teach you. Fortunately, a lot of good scientific work has been done on this. Professor Benny Shannon, who is the professor of psychiatry at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, has personally drunk ayahuasca more than 300 times himself. I've only drunk it 18 times so far. And he has compared the experiences of hundreds and hundreds of people from all over the world who have drunk ayahuasca. And you know what? All of them meet these serpents. And in fact, they meet a particular entity who takes the form of a serpent, and she is thought of as the ayahuasca spirit. She projects deep concern with the state of the environment into the minds of those who drink ayahuasca, and a feeling of love and concern for humanity as a whole. This is universally reported by people who drink ayahuasca, and it's one of the mysteries of this astonishing sacred brew of the Amazon. And perhaps the only way to explain this mystery is that it indeed is opening a hidden doorway inside our own minds through which we may project our consciousness into another world, and that world is real.
Well, I understand that the Harvard Medical School has carried out long-term research in this project in Brazil, where the use of how do you pronounce that again?
Ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca is protected under laws of religious freedom.
That's absolutely right, and thanks for raising that. That's a very important point. What's happened is, you see that in Brazil and in Peru and in other countries of the Amazon basin, the consumption of ayahuasca is totally legal. Not only is it legal, but it is in fact protected under laws of religious freedom. Nobody may tamper with this right of the individual to drink ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is originally a medicine of the jungle, and it's found amongst the tribal and hunter-gatherer cultures of the jungle. More than 70 different cultures use it, but in modern times it's found its way into the cities as well. So you find people in Rio de Janeiro, for example, drinking ayahuasca twice a week as part of a religious ceremony. There are two ayahuasca churches. One of them mixes aspects of Christianity with the traditional religion of the Amazon. It's called the Santo Daime. The other is the União de Vegetal, which has a more philosophical tradition, which it mixes with ayahuasca. And so these groups use ayahuasca very frequently. And taking advantage of this, researchers from Harvard Medical School have conducted a very long-term study, going back almost 15 years, of people who use ayahuasca up to twice a week throughout the year. And what this study has done, it's given a completely clean bill of health to ayahuasca. They have been unable to document a single negative effect from the consumption of ayahuasca. On the contrary, they have again and again documented extremely positive effects. People who were alcoholics stop being alcoholics. A man who perhaps beat his wife stops beating his wife and becomes a model husband and father. People get better integrated into society. They do their jobs more responsibly and more thoroughly, and amazingly, across the entire group surveyed, an average 6-point increase in IQ has been documented. And it's partly because of this that the Supreme Court in the United States just recently was forced to allow members of the União de Vegetal in America, and most of them are presently in the state of New Mexico, in Santa Fe. There's a UDV, a União de Vegetal chapter there. They are now legally allowed to drink ayahuasca in the United States, even though it contains a Schedule 1 substance, namely DMT. They're allowed to drink it because it is recognized that they are pursuing their religion. And although the powers of government find many ways to interfere in our daily lives, religious freedom is still a precious value in our societies. And because of that reason, ayahuasca is allowed to be drunk by members of the União de Vegetal. There's just one other thing I'd like to say about it, because people tend to react, oh, ayahuasca is just another drug, and they've heard all the propaganda of the war on drugs, and they tend to dismiss it automatically. People who are addicted to really dangerous, hard drugs like heroin and cocaine, as we know, have great difficulty in relieving themselves of that addiction, in getting off the addiction. There are a number of clinics around the world now that are giving ayahuasca to drug addicts with astonishing success. It's a great unreported story there's a clinic in Peru, for example, run by a French doctor called Dr. Jacques Mabit. They bring cocaine and heroin addicts there for 1 month. In that month, they drink ayahuasca 12 times. At the end of the month, more than half of them leave without any addiction whatsoever to the substance they were addicted to. They've undergone a kind of personal revelation during their ayahuasca journeys, which makes them no longer need the hard drug they were addicted to. So far from being something that we can lump together with the vilified drugs in our society, ayahuasca is in fact a way out of drug addiction.
Well, we'll return with our guest, Graham Hancock, Supernatural Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, and we're going to talk a little bit about those when we return. It's published by the Disinformation Company, grahamhancock.com, or go to 21stcenturyradio.com and click on this week's show at the top right-hand corner.
Hi, this is Linda Moulton Howe, reporter and editor of EarthFiles.com. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus, exploring issues beyond the 6 o'clock news.
Now, to return to the theme of the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, is it a correct summary of your theory to say that you think encounters with spirit beings from other dimensions may have been the catalyst for the great leap forward in human evolution that took place about 35,000 years ago?
Yes, I think that's an absolutely fair summary of my views, and it's why I give the book the subtitle "Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind." Something extraordinary happened to our ancestors around 35 or 40,000 years ago. They already had all the hardware of being modern humans. The brain was already fully evolved in the form that it is today, and had been for at least 150,000 years before that. But the software wasn't present, and what happened around 35,000 years ago was a software event. Something changed the programming of the human brain, and the overwhelming evidence, which I go into in great depth in Supernatural, is that what changed the programming was, first of all, probably accidental encounters with hallucinogenic plants in different parts of the world. And I mentioned earlier, I'm pretty certain in Northern Europe, it was the little mushroom called Psilocybe semilanceata. It's very likely that our ancestors, who were hunter-gatherers, were traveling through the forest. They saw these little mushrooms growing typically around animal dung, and they would pick the mushrooms, thinking them a food item, and then they would, instead of finding it was a food item, they would find that it unleashed an extraordinary experience. And for the first time, they were seeing things that were not actually physically present in their daily reality. And it's these beings that they encountered in these states that they document and that they paint on the cave walls. And as I said, exactly at the moment that they do that, we observe this huge change in human behavior, which sets us on the road to the modern world. It's as though 6 million years of being stuck in the most boring rut you can imagine has come to an end, and we take a completely new direction and become the spiritual, lateral thinking, creative beings. All the qualities that we most highly prize in human beings are just switched on overnight then. And my suggestion is that it is precisely because these realms and beings that we encountered in altered states of consciousness, because they are real, that this happened, that there are entities out there, other dimensional entities, who we may only contact in altered states of consciousness, who have an interest in the human race, and who teach us, who taught us everything we needed to know to become human. And this is precisely what happens to shamans even today in the Amazon. They see the spirits they encounter fundamentally as teachers. It's true of the shamans amongst the Kalahari Bushmen in southern Africa. They don't use a hallucinogen to get into an altered state. They use a particular kind of rhythmic dance, which actually goes on for 12 or 14 or 16 hours without stopping. And until they bleed from the nose and fall to the ground. And as they fall to the ground, they experience their spirits leaving their bodies, often climbing up threads of light into the sky, sometimes going underground. They have a sense of traveling underground, and there they encounter spirit beings who give them teachings, who tell them which plants to mix together to provide a remedy for an unwell member of the tribe, who tell them where to go to find the animals that they need to hunt in order to eat, who even help them to bring rain. These experiences and encounters still today are teaching experiences, and it seems to me that part of the problem with the modern world is that we have cut ourselves off from those teachings. In a sense, we are sadly entering another rut in human behavior, the same kind of rut that our ancestors were stuck in when they used the same kind of stone tool for 1 million years without changing it. Today our tools are called science, and we place so much faith in the tools of science that we've allowed them to dominate our experience and to dominate our world, and we think that there's no other way of knowing, that there's no other way of accessing reality. And this could be a terrible mistake, and in order to shake ourselves out of that rut, we need again to embrace and to value altered states of consciousness. In our society today, if we want to insult a person, we will call that person a dreamer. But in ancient times, dreams were regarded as a valid way of knowing, and I think that sense needs to be recovered. We need to make contact again with the ancient teachers of mankind who have our interests at heart and who want to help us if only we're willing to open our minds and eyes to them.
Amen. Boy, that, of course, I think is the key problem that we have on planet Earth, the rut that we call science today, in regards to the box that they have created to put us in.
Yes.
And then when you have a box that the only way to get inside that box is through peer-reviewed knowledge and information and control of locations where that information is stored, you have a pretty tight box here. That
extremely tight box, which is constantly congratulating itself on being
yes,
on its absolute brilliance and its achievements. Now, there's no doubt that science has achieved a great deal, for which we may all be thankful. But the mistake is to believe that this is the only way of gaining valid and useful knowledge. There are many other ways of gaining valid and useful knowledge which science despises, but which we desperately need to rediscover, I think, if we are to avoid the coming cataclysm.
I agree.
Because mankind is marching blindfold into the abyss right now. And many of the shamans who I worked with in the Amazon made it clear to me their analysis of this situation. It is because we have severed our connection with spirit.
Absolutely. Yes,
and we have to reestablish that connection, and it may be that these sacred and ancient plants that shamans have used for tens of thousands of years may be the most effective way for us to do that.
Well, certainly it's a heck of a better way than where we are right now, because as we have here in the United States of America, a president who believes that global warming is just a big hoax, there's no big problem, that there aren't going to be any serious weather changes as we watch Katrina and we watch what happened after Katrina, and we watch a president who was too darn busy for 4 or 5 days to check it out, telling us that Mr. Brown was doing a fine job, telling us Mr. Rumsfeld is doing a great job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
It's terrifying, isn't it, really?
It is terrifying.
The way that our leaders mislead us, the way that they deceive us and lie to us, the way that they use mind control, that they flood our brains from morning to night with hours and hours of completely meaningless so-called reality television, that they legislate against us if we seek to explore our own consciousness using the ancient shamanic plants. We can actually be sent to prison. It's an astonishing state of affairs where an adult who claims to live in a free society is not allowed to explore his or her own consciousness. You know, if I am not sovereign over my consciousness, then what am I sovereign over? And what is the point of speaking of democracy or freedom when we live in a society that will actually send us to jail for exploring our own consciousness in the privacy of our own homes, doing no harm to others? Clearly, we live in a completely insane and tyrannical society that seeks to impose control even inside our minds.
And, of course, I'd like to put an emphasis here on our healthcare systems, in which within our hospitals today, we know about 90 to 100,000 people die in a hospital. This is from just the surroundings within the hospital.
Yeah, hospitals are really dangerous places.
And most people are becoming aware of that, but they don't realize that 90, I mean, they're just on the front page of the Sun papers just the other day dealt with, Hopkins researchers saying, we should be washing our hands more, as if we didn't know. And we should be sterilizing our needles better, etc. I mean, this was a major report coming out from Johns Hopkins University just a day or two ago. We knew all of this information. Why wasn't it being followed? Why wasn't it being discussed that 90 to 100,000 people die in a hospital from being not just being misdiagnosed, but their actual surroundings? Doctors and nurses should know better than this.
Absolutely, they should know better. I mean, it's a very sinister thing. But our hospitals are gigantic killing machines, particularly when it comes to the elderly in our society who are hospitalized and then literally killed off, given no time to do the spiritual work that they need to do. Often doped out completely on morphine. This happened to my father, who died in 2003. He had spiritual work to do, but the doctors around him kept giving him much more morphine than he needed for his pain. And he knew this. He was a doctor himself. He knew what he needed, and he was resisting this enforced treatment right up to the end. It gave me a whole completely different view of hospitals and doctors and how they work. And in many ways, I think we would benefit enormously from going back and from being open to the shamanistic way of healing, which recognizes that healing is a spiritual process, that human beings are fundamentally spiritual beings, and you are not going to heal a spiritual being purely with material solutions. You have to have a spiritual solution to that as well, and that is what is missing from our hospitals and our medical establishment today, which, of course, are totally infiltrated and taken over and serving the interests of big business, the big pharmaceutical businesses, which seek to medicate every aspect of our daily lives.
Well, I wish you could say something I disagree with, Graham, but this is a serious problem. This really is a very serious problem. We're 100,000 deaths. I keep coming back to this because I think of that. And then I think of the big stories of too much vitamin C has proven in one particular case around the world as being delivering the death blow. One case. And that's blown up to be,
That's blown up into a huge brouhaha.
Yes, indeed.
And taken completely out of context. Where in fact the really lethal things are the mainstream medicine that we're taught to revere and admire.
Well, one of the other folks I highly admire is Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick, and of course more recent information that we've covered in the past here, but I'd like to talk about that. Is it technically possible to record information on DNA? First, I want to get to that before we get to Crick.
Absolutely. That is that is another area that I explore in Supernatural. The mystery that I'm dealing with in this book is the mystery of universal experiences that are supposedly, quote unquote, non-real, because hallucinations are defined as illusions and fantasies by our scientists. If they are illusions and fantasies, then why is it that everybody all around the world has the same experiences and meets the same beings in these altered states of consciousness? Now, one explanation, the explanation that I personally favor, is that those realms that we call spirit worlds are real, absolutely real, that these are other dimensions which we can access in an altered state of consciousness. And again, I use that analogy of opening a secret doorway inside our minds in an altered state so that we may project our consciousness through into another dimension. But there's another possibility, and this is the possibility that there's a secret archive inscribed on our DNA, which of course all of us share in common, and that this is a teaching program inscribed on our DNA that we may only access in altered states of consciousness. We have to be in an altered state in order to access these teachings. And because it is an interactive teaching program on our DNA, again, this would explain why everybody has the same experiences. And there may be a way to unify these two things. It could even be that the material world, the physical world in which we are presently incarnated, is indeed the creation of spirit beings. And if they created that physical and material realm, then they certainly created DNA and would have been able to use DNA in extraordinary ways. And this is where the work of Francis Crick, who by the way was a complete atheist, he didn't believe in spirits at all, but Francis Crick nevertheless could not accept that DNA, that the DNA molecule, which is the basis of all life, he could not accept that it had evolved on this planet.
Well, we'll find out more about Francis Crick. This is an extraordinary story that I'd love to hear from time to... I love stories, no two ways about it. With our guest, Graham Hancock, Supernatural Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, the disinformation company, grahamhancock.com, or go to 21stcenturyradio.com and click on this week's show at the top right-hand corner.
Howdy, this is Joe Mars, journalist and author of Crossfire, Alien Agenda, Ruled by Secrecy, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus. You know, a mind is a terrible thing to waste, so pay attention.
Now, the Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick, who discovered the double helix structure of DNA, plays an important part in your story, and you began that last segment. What is the important part that he plays?
Well, first of all, there's an astonishing piece of information about Francis Crick, which entered the public domain only after his death. and this is that Crick made his discovery of the double helix structure of DNA not entirely through the use of the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness that is so admired by science, but actually in an altered state of consciousness. Crick admitted shortly before his death that he was a regular user of LSD during the 1950s. Of course, LSD was legal then. It hadn't yet been criminalized. And Crick felt that it played a very important role in expanding his creativity. And it was under the influence of LSD that he first saw, in the form of a vision, the DNA molecule as a double helix. In other words, Crick, just as shamans receive teachings from the spirit world that they enter in altered states of consciousness that are appropriate to their state of knowledge, Crick received a teaching that was appropriate to his state of knowledge, and it was a teaching that won him the Nobel Prize. So here we have possibly the greatest scientific discovery of our times, and we discover that the man who made that discovery was under the influence of LSD and saw it in a vision. Now, the interesting thing about Crick is that he went on, long after winning his Nobel Prize, to consider the mystery of life in many, many ways and in great depth. And in 1981, he published a book that very few people see today, called Life Itself, in which he revealed astonishing information about the DNA molecule. Crick would have hated to be called an exponent of intelligent design, but that's effectively what he was, because coming at the problem from the perspective of pure science, looking at the scientific evidence, he just could not accept that the DNA molecule had evolved on this planet. There's a mainstream scientific theory from which he separated himself in this book, which suggests that DNA just evolved somehow accidentally. It's envisaged that there was some kind of primeval soup lying on the early Earth about 3.9 billion years ago, when the Earth was first cool enough to support life, and that somehow different ingredients in this soup, just accidentally bumping against each other, magically produced the DNA molecule. Crick and the astrophysicist Sir Fred Hoyle argued that you would be more likely to assemble a fully functioning jumbo jet by passing a hurricane through a junkyard than you would be for the DNA molecule to assemble itself accidentally by the bumping together of molecules in the primeval soup. They just felt it was as unlikely as that. And to cut a long story short, what Crick suggested was this could not have happened on the Earth. There just wasn't time. So he hypothesized a distant planet revolving around another star, somewhere far, far away on the other side of the galaxy. He pointed out that there's been more than 13 billion years since the Big Bang. There's been time for life to have evolved twice. And this is the one weakness of his theory, is he didn't explain how this could have happened, but he suggested that on that other planet somehow conditions were right in a way that they were not right on the Earth, and the DNA molecule did appear accidentally. And then it went on through the process of evolution, through microbes, bacteria, gradually evolving into more complex forms, and eventually an intelligent being appeared on that planet. And then he suggested that those intelligent beings, he suggested they had a more advanced civilization than ours. And I do need to emphasize here, this is Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize winner's idea, not Graham Hancock's idea, that they had evolved a more advanced civilization than ours, and then they discovered that they faced certain doom. Perhaps a supernova was going to explode in their vicinity and would sterilize their planet. How would they respond to this, he asked himself? Well, the first thing they'd try to do is see if they could get themselves off the planet to another suitable planet where life might be sustained. But they would know that this was not possible, that the distances in interstellar space are too great, that journeys of millions of years would be involved to get to another planet. So there was no way that they could take their physical bodies off the planet. And so what he suggested they would do instead, and what we would do in a similar circumstance, would be that they protected and preserved the essence of life. He suggested that they gathered together bacteria, the hardiest creatures that we know of, perhaps genetically engineered them in some ways to make them even more hardy, packed them into cryogenic containers in spaceships, fired those spaceships off into the universe in all directions, and 3.9 billion years ago, one of those spaceships bumped into the early Earth, spilled out its contents of bacteria into the then lifeless primeval soup on the early Earth, and those bacteria began reproducing, and 3.9 billion years later, here we are, the result of 3.9 billion years of evolution from those original bacteria sent with their DNA from another planet. And what I'm suggesting in Supernatural, just to take Crick's argument a little further than he himself took it, is that if we were made, if we literally are the creation of an intelligent civilization from the other side of the galaxy who sent DNA to our planet in bacteria, then they may have used DNA to pass a message to us about ourselves. They may have recorded information on DNA. And this is where so-called junk DNA is so interesting. It's highly preserved, going back to the earliest times. Our scientists don't understand what it is, even though it's in fact 97% of all DNA is so-called junk DNA. It's only 3% of DNA that's gathered together in our genes. And the latest science is indicating, first of all, that junk DNA has a deep mathematical structure that is identical to the structure of all human languages. This is the work of Professor Eugene Stanley at the University of Boston, who told me that it seems as though some kind of message is written in our DNA. And maybe that's what's going on here. Maybe there is a message from our Maker written in our DNA. We are the first creatures on this planet who have evolved to a state where we can read that message. And we need to be in altered states of consciousness in order to access it, the kind of states that shamans have been exploring for thousands of years, the kind of states that switched us on 35,000 years ago. And this, too, would explain the astonishing universality of these experiences, and it would add an urgency to the issue that there may be something of vital importance for us to learn, and that we need to embrace altered states of consciousness if we're going to learn it.
You note that junk DNA has a linguistic structure. What does that mean?
Well, there's a linguistic law called Zipf's law, which actually was first discovered back in the 1930s by a linguist, naturally enough, called Zipf. And what he found is that if you take a large text in any human language, it doesn't matter which language it is, if you take a large text in any human language, you're going to find, obviously, that some words occur more commonly than others. And if you then list those words in order of the frequency of occurrence, obviously the word that occurs most often will be number 1, and the word that occurs least often, will be number 10 or number 100 or whatever. And I won't go into the exact details here. They're fully set out in my book. But what emerges is that there is a deep mathematical structure between rank and frequency of words, which produces a straight line on the graph. And that mathematical structure, the precise same mathematical structure, is found in so-called junk DNA. In other words, if you were looking at this as a kind of mess of letters strewn on the floor, and you observed that mathematical structure emerging from it, you would have to say this is not alphabetical soup. This is in fact a human language, and that's what you find in junk DNA. You do not find that structure in the so-called coding DNA, which our cells use for the construction of proteins and creating our bodies. It's only found in so-called junk DNA, and there's in fact a huge industry now which is looking into the potential of recording information on DNA. Patents are being taken out. It's recognized that DNA has a limitless storage capacity, that we could carry with us all our personal records recorded on our own DNA. Scientists have already succeeded in recording songs on DNA. As everybody knows, DNA has a highly coded structure. And theoretically, it would be possible to record the entire knowledge of a civilization on DNA, and that knowledge, once written on DNA, would be passed on down the generations endlessly and limitlessly for millions or even for billions of years. And so that's the suggestion here.
Right.
That if our DNA indeed did come to us from another planet, as the Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick suggested, then it's highly likely that those who sent it here would have anticipated that eventually an intelligent, sentient being would emerge, and they would have wanted to communicate with that being, and the way to do it would have been through the vehicle of recorded information on DNA.
I'd hate to see the military, industrial, and every other situation in control of that, as they could implant anything they wanted.
So would I, and I'm afraid there is a danger of that, and it's already being looked at from a cryptographic point of view as a way to hide information.
I bet you. Certainly.
This is what's happening. This is the nature of the society that we live in. But I think what will defeat that is our birthright as human beings, and that these extraordinary experiences in altered states of consciousness are transformatory experiences from which we emerge with a highly questioning attitude to control over our lives by others. So in order to access this information, one has to enter an altered state of consciousness, and once having explored altered states of consciousness, we can no longer tolerate the interference of the government in every aspect of our daily lives, most important of all, inside our heads. And from this, I do see hope for the future.
Well, I'll wager that hope is not going to come from the United States of America. It's going to come from elsewhere.
It's going to come from the grassroots.
Yes.
It's not going to come from the United States of America government, but fortunately America is a big country, and there are huge numbers of just wonderful, wonderful Americans who are so disturbed by what their government is doing, just as there are huge numbers of good people in Britain who are hugely disturbed by what our government is doing. Because, of course, the British and American governments are hand in hand in these destructive policies that are being pursued throughout the world. And I detect a groundswell of disgust and outrage at government control, which I think is the best hope we have for the future.
That's certainly true. Now, what are the implications of your research for social policy in the rich industrialized countries? Could it be that the shamans of tribal societies have much to teach us?
Yes, they definitely do have much to teach us, and I think we have to review our attitude to altered states. Whenever a government declares a war on something, we have to look out for the lies. Whether it's the war on terrorism or the war on drugs, we have to look out for the lies that our government is telling us. And our government is telling us that hallucinogens are bad for us, that they're dangerous, that they're going to drive us all mad. And actually, the scientific evidence is that hallucinogens are not bad for us, are not dangerous, and are not going to drive us all mad. These are serious substances. I'm not encouraging people to take drugs, but what I'm saying is that for thousands and thousands of years, certain visionary plants have been field tested in human populations and have only done good things, and may have played a fundamental role in making us human in the first place. If we don't want to miss out on the next step forward in our own evolution, it's going to be essential that we open our minds to the value of these kinds of experiences, that we do not send people to prison for exploring their own consciousness. It's sadly the case that the American government is at war with its own people, that there are hundreds of thousands of people in prison in the United States today simply because they have privately, doing no harm to others, sought to use sacred plants to explore their own consciousness. And as I said earlier, if a man or a woman is not sovereign over their own consciousness, then they are not sovereign over anything. And we might as well not waste our time talking about highfalutin ideas like democracy or freedom if we haven't taken that first step and said that an adult is free to explore their own consciousness as long as they do not do harm to others. So the greatest implication for social policy, in my view, is that the government has to step out of our heads and stop trying to control our very thoughts. It has no right to be there. We have had 2,000 years of progress towards so-called democracy, and if that democracy cannot deliver freedom of consciousness, then it isn't worth having.
This, friends, this is an extraordinary work, and we have only skimmed, I hate to use the proverbial skim the surface, but we have. This is a book that will take you a long time to read, and you will learn about, in my opinion, the most important things on planet Earth. And we have biases on 21st Century Radio, and we've related what those biases are. We believe that we are not alone in the universe and never have been, number one, and that human beings are not machines. Human beings have an immortal component, a divine component. which, when you become conscious of, you live in an altered state. Now, I understand that this radical thought is not so radical. It's not radical. This is old. This is old as the hills. And I want to thank you, Graham Hancock, with this extraordinary work, Supernatural Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, the Disinformation Company. We hope it sells 1 billion copies. Go to grahamhancock.com and see his other extraordinary work, or go to 21stcenturyradio.com and click on this week's show at the top right-hand corner. Thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much indeed, and Happy New Year to you and to all listeners.
Same here. And next week, we'll be with you again here on 21st Century Radio, 8 to 10 p.m. Sunday night, as we enter our 20th year. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington, and I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus.